In 2023, the state of Texas strapped 8 men to a gurney and watched them take their last breath. We'll walk through the crimes that put them on death row, the victims who never came home, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before the needle went in. But here is what nobody tells you. Some of these men went to their death still claiming innocence. Some of them wept. Some of them prayed. Some smiled at their families through the glass. And one of them, a man who once wore a badge, who once swore an oath to protect and serve, looked at the witnesses in that chamber and answered his final question with 2 words that nobody in that room knew how to respond to. That depends. That was it. 2 words. Then the drugs began to flow. 8 men, 8 gurneys, 8 needles, 8 final heartbeats inside the walls of the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas. 8 families who lost someone they loved, and 8 other families who had already lost someone long before this year ever began. The families of the victims who spent years, in some cases decades, waiting for this moment to arrive. This is not a video that will tell you the death penalty is right, and it is not a video that will tell you it is wrong. What it will do is show you exactly what happened, the crimes, the courts, the final hours, and the final words, and let you decide for yourself. Because by the time we get to the end of this, you may find that the answer is not as simple as you thought walking in. This is what happened. Before we begin, drop a comment right now and tell us, do you think Texas got it right all 8 times? We want to know where you stand before you hear the full story, because by the end of this video, you might not be so sure. Case 1. Robert Allen Freda. Her children were inside the house when it happened. They were right there, behind that door, while their mother was being shot twice in the head in her own garage. And the man prosecutors say gave the order to pull that trigger? He was a police officer, a man who carried a badge, a man who had sworn out loud in front of witnesses to protect human life. That is where this story begins. Not in a courtroom, not on death row, in a garage in Atascocita, Texas, on the night of November 9, 1994, when Freda stepped out of her car and never stepped back in. She was 33 years old. She had 3 children, a pending divorce, and a husband who, according to prosecutors, had decided that the easiest way to win a custody battle was to make sure she wasn't alive to fight it. Freda was found slumped in her garage, shot twice at close range. Her children, who had been waiting inside for their mother to come through the door, were now waiting for something that was never going to happen. First responders arrived to a scene that was quiet in the worst possible way. No signs of forced entry. No robbery. Nothing taken. Just a woman on the ground and a house full of children who didn't yet understand that their lives had just been divided into a before and an after. Investigators moved quickly, and almost immediately, the trail led somewhere that made everyone in that department deeply uncomfortable. It led to one of their own. Robert Allen Freda was a public safety officer, a man who worked in law enforcement in the suburbs of Houston. He and Farah had been married for years, but by 1994, the marriage had collapsed into something ugly. There were allegations of controlling behavior, of emotional abuse, of a man who could not accept that a woman had chosen to leave him. The divorce was bitter. The custody dispute was vicious, and according to the people who knew both of them, Robert Freda had made no secret of the fact that he wanted Farah gone. What nobody could prove, at least not right away, was exactly how far he was willing to go to make that happen. Here is what the investigation eventually uncovered. Freda did not pull the trigger himself. What prosecutors alleged is that he recruited a man from his gym, a fellow fitness enthusiast named Joseph Pristash, and asked him to arrange the murder. Pristash then hired the actual shooter, a man named Howard Guidry. 3 people, 1 dead woman, and a payment that, if it finally came out, stopped people in the courtroom cold. $3,000. $3,000. That is what prosecutors say Robert Freda paid to have the mother of his children shot twice in the head. Think about that number for a moment, not in the abstract. Think about what $3,000 means. It is a month's rent in most cities. It is a used car. It is a family vacation. It is the kind of number you spend without thinking twice on something you want. And prosecutors argued that what Robert Freda wanted badly enough to pay for was the permanent removal of the woman who had given birth to his 3 children. Those children were inside that house. They heard something that night, or they didn't, and they spent years wondering why their mother never came through the door. And either way, they grew up carrying the weight of November 9th, 1994, on their backs for the rest of their lives, while their father, meanwhile, was alive, was breathing, was filing legal motions, was telling anyone who would listen that he had nothing to do with it. There was also one other detail that came out during the investigation. A witness told prosecutors that Freda had not only sought someone to arrange the murder, he had allegedly offered sexual favors as part of the negotiation. A police officer, a father, a man who stood at his wife's side on their wedding day, allegedly shopping for a hitman the way someone else might shop for a service they didn't want to do themselves. If you are sitting with discomfort right now, that is the correct response. Robert Freda was arrested and charged with capital murder. At trial in 1996, the jury convicted him, and he was sentenced to death. But the story did not end there, because it almost never ends cleanly when law enforcement is involved. His conviction was overturned. The appeals courts found that certain witness testimony had been obtained under hypnosis, and that the reliability of that evidence was compromised. In a case already built on the cooperation of men who had accepted immunity deals in exchange for testifying against him, the foundation was shakier than it looked. Freda walked back from the edge of the execution chamber, at least temporarily, and the legal machinery ground forward. He was retried and convicted again in 2009. He spent the years between then and 2023 on death row at the Polunsky unit, maintaining his innocence, filing appeals, and growing old inside a system that had decided twice that he deserved to die. Now here's where this story shifts, because before we get to what happened on January 10th, 2023, there's something you need to know. Something that was decided in the hours before his execution that has never been fully resolved, and that the state of Texas would very much prefer you not think too hard about. On the morning of Robert Freda's execution, a judge in Travis County granted an emergency injunction. Not based on his guilt or innocence, not based on the hypnotized witnesses or the immunity deals or any of the arguments his lawyers had been making for years, based on something else entirely: the drugs. Texas had been extending the expiration dates on its lethal injection drugs, essentially relabeling compounds past the point that standard pharmaceutical protocol would allow. Freda's attorneys argued that this was illegal, that administering expired drugs constituted a form of cruel and unusual punishment, and that a man could not be executed with chemicals that a pharmacy would not legally dispense. A judge agreed. For a few hours on January 10th, 2023, Robert Freda had a legal order standing between him and that gurney. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overruled it. They did not dispute the factual basis of the argument. They did not say the drugs were definitely fine. They simply decided that the injunction should not stand and that the execution would proceed as scheduled. At 6 p.m. that evening, Robert Allen Freda was walked into the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit and strapped to the gurney. The witnesses gathered on the other side of the glass. Among them, people who had waited 29 years for this moment. People who had watched a trial and a conviction, and an appeal, and another trial, and another conviction, and 14 more years of legal filings, all while carrying the night of November 9th, 1994, inside their chests every single day. The warden asked Robert Freda if he had a final statement. He looked at the room, and he said 2 words. "That depends." Nobody spoke. Nobody knew what to do with that. The warden moved forward. The injection began. 24 minutes later, after a series of slow, heavy breaths that gradually stilled, Robert Allen Fratta was pronounced dead. He was 65 years old. That depends. He took the explanation for those words with him. Nobody in that chamber asked him what they meant. Nobody had the chance. Some people who were there that night believe it was a final act of defiance, a refusal to give the system the clean ending it wanted. Some believe it was directed at the families, a coded acknowledgement of something he could not say plainly. Some believe he simply had nothing left to say and chose ambiguity over silence. The children Farah left behind, the ones who were inside that house on November 9th, 1994, they had grown up by then. They had built lives. They had carried this. And on January 10th, 2023, they watched the state of Texas deliver the sentence that two separate juries had reached after hearing all the evidence. Whether it gave them anything, peace, closure, release, or just another complicated feeling to add to the pile, is not something anyone outside that room can answer. What we can say is this: Farah Fratta was 33 years old. Her children were in the house, and whoever made the decision that ended her life in that garage made it knowing exactly what it would cost, not just her life, but theirs. Before we move to the second execution of 2023, if you're still here, if this story has landed the way I think it has, hit subscribe right now. Not because of an algorithm, because the next 7 cases in this video are going to ask harder questions than this one. And one of them, a triple murder case where a black man's attorneys argued the entire trial was racially compromised from the start, and the Supreme Court refused to even look at it, is going to sit with you in a very different way than Robert Fratta did. You need to hear that one. But first, we go to February 1st, a high-speed chase, a police officer who never made it home, and a 23-year-old with a gun who, 16 years later, looked at the family of the man he killed and said he hoped his death would bring them closure. The question is whether he meant it, and whether it did. Case 2, Wesley Ruiz. The call came in as a routine traffic stop. That is how most of them start. A car, a plate, a reason to pull someone over. Nothing that should end with a police officer bleeding out on the side of a Dallas road. Nothing that should end with a 23-year-old in handcuffs being walked toward a future that had just collapsed into a single word: death. But that is exactly what happened on the night Wesley Ruiz decided to run. The year was 2007. Wesley Ruiz was 23 years old, and when officers attempted to stop him, he did not pull over. He ran, accelerating into a high-speed chase through the streets of Dallas, the kind of pursuit that dispatchers hate because everyone who works in law enforcement knows how they can end. Badly, suddenly, with no time to undo anything. When the chase came to a stop, Wesley Ruiz got out of the car with a gun. Officer Mark Nix was there. And then he wasn't. Mark Nix was a Dallas police officer. That is the sentence that gets read in courtrooms, printed in newspapers, cited in appeals. But Mark Nix was also a human being who had a life outside of his badge, a life that included people who loved him, people who depended on him, people who had no idea that the night of his death was going to become the axis around which the rest of their lives would permanently turn. He had a family. He had people who set a place for him at the table, people who expected him to walk through a door that he never walked through again. Children, if you have children, if you have ever watched a child ask where someone is and not understood the answer, you already know what the weeks and months after Mark Nix's death looked like inside that household. You already know what that absence feels like when it moves in and never leaves. A gun, a chase, a decision made in the span of a few seconds by a 23-year-old who may not have understood, in those seconds, the full weight of what he was doing. And now 2 families, permanently broken, one by a bullet, one by everything that followed it. Wesley Ruiz was arrested, charged with capital murder, tried, and convicted in 2008. The jury sentenced him to death. He was 24 years old when that sentence came down, 1 year older than he had been on the night he made the decision that put him in that courtroom. Young enough that the ink on his adult life was barely dry. Old enough, under Texas law, to die for it. He was sent to the Polunsky unit, and he waited. For 15 years, he waited. Now here is the part of this story that the state of Texas does not put in its press releases. The part that Wesley Ruiz's attorneys raised in appeal after appeal, and that the courts rejected every single time. Not because it was frivolous, but because the law, as it currently stands, does not require them to act on it. Wesley Ruiz was 23 years old when he shot Mark Nix. 23. In 2005, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Roper v. Simmons that it is unconstitutional to execute someone for a crime they committed before the age of 18. The science behind that ruling was not arbitrary. It was based on decades of neurodevelopmental research showing that the adolescent brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control, long-term consequence assessment, and the ability to fully weigh the impact of a decision before making it, is not fully developed until the age of approximately 25. 25. Wesley Ruiz was 23. That means that on the night of the chase, on the night he got out of that car with a gun, the part of his brain that exists specifically to stop a person from doing something catastrophic and irreversible was, by the scientific consensus of the medical community, still 2 years away from being complete. That is not an excuse. Let that be clear. Mark Nix is still dead. His family still lost him. Nothing about the neuroscience of brain development unkills a police officer or unbreaks a family. But it is a fact. And it is the kind of fact that, in a system that claims to take culpability and intent and cognitive capacity seriously, should at minimum give someone pause. Texas did not pause. The courts did not pause. Every appeal went nowhere. Every argument about developmental science, about the proximity of his age to the protected threshold, about the question of whether a 23-year-old brain can bear the same moral weight as a fully developed adult mind, all of it was heard and rejected and filed away. And Wesley Ruiz kept aging on death row 1 year at a time, while the boy who had made that decision in 2007 became a man who would never see the outside of a prison again. If you have been watching this video and you have found yourself certain, absolutely certain, about how you feel about the death penalty, I want you to sit with this for a moment. Not with Wesley Ruiz, with the question itself. At what point does the law's line between protected youth and punishable adulthood stop being a bright line and start being an arbitrary one? 18, 21, 23, 25. The number changes depending on which right we're discussing. The right to vote, to drink, to rent a car, to be considered fully formed enough to die for your worst decision. We move the line depending on what is convenient. Wesley Ruiz fell on the wrong side of it by 2 years. By the time February 1st, 2023 arrived, Wesley Ruiz was 43 years old. The 23-year-old who had fled from that traffic stop was, in any meaningful psychological sense, gone. The man strapped to the gurney in Huntsville that evening had lived 20 more years inside a cell. 20 years of whatever reflection, regret, or reckoning happens in solitary confinement when a man has nothing to do but think about what he did and what it cost. Whether that constitutes justice or a different kind of horror depends entirely on who you ask. The execution was scheduled for 6 p.m. Before the lethal injection began, the warden asked Wesley Ruiz if he had a final statement. He did. He turned toward the witnesses, and among them were members of Mark Nix's family, people who had driven to Huntsville to watch this happen, people who had waited 16 years for this moment, and he spoke directly to them. He apologized. He said he hoped that his death would bring them closure. Closure. That word gets used a great deal around executions. Families say they need it. Prosecutors promise it. Victim advocates point to it as one of the purposes of capital punishment. The idea that when the man who took someone from you is himself taken, something inside you can finally close, finally rest, finally stop holding the door open for a grief that has no natural end. But here is what the research on capital punishment and victim family grief actually shows, with remarkable consistency. For many families, not all, but many, the execution does not close anything. The absence doesn't fill. The person who was taken does not come back when the needle goes in. What happens instead often is that the execution forces the family to relive the original loss all over again. The trial, the crime, the death, at high volume, in public, in front of cameras, and then the coverage ends and the quiet returns, and the grief is still there, exactly where they left it. Mark Nix's family sat in that chamber and watched Wesley Ruiz die. Whether it gave them what he promised, what he hoped, is not something anyone outside that room can say with certainty. That is their private grief, and it belongs to them. What we can say is that Wesley Ruiz was pronounced dead at 6:41 p.m., 22 minutes after the injection began. He was 43 years old. A 23-year-old made a decision. A 43-year-old man died for it. And somewhere between those two numbers, between that panicked night in 2007 and that quiet room in 2023, is a question that Texas asked once, answered once, and then spent 16 years refusing to revisit. Was the man on that gurney the same man who pulled that trigger? Does it matter? Mark Nix's family would tell you one thing. Wesley Ruiz's family would tell you another. The neuroscientists would tell you a third. And the state of Texas has already told you what it decided, in the only language it has that is permanent and irreversible. There is no appeal from a flat line. We are 2 stories into 2023, 2 executions, 2 men dead by the state's hand, and we have not yet gotten to the case that, out of all 8, drew the most attention from civil rights attorneys, legal scholars, and human rights organizations: a triple murder, a death sentence, a Supreme Court that declined to intervene, and a black defendant whose lawyers spent years arguing that the trial was racially compromised from its very foundation. The 3rd execution of 2023 happened on February 8th, just 7 days after Wesley Ruiz drew his last breath. His name was John Ballantyne. And what happened to him in that courtroom, in those appeals, and in that chamber is something you need to hear in full, because the questions it raises do not have clean answers. And the Supreme Court of the United States, when given the chance to provide one, chose silence instead. That is next. Case 3. John Ballantyne. They were asleep. That is the detail that does not leave you. That is the detail that every attorney, every journalist, every person who has ever read this case carries out of it and cannot put down. 3 teenagers in their beds, in the middle of the night, in the one place that every human being, regardless of age, assumes is safe: their own home, their own room, their own darkness. Each one shot once in the head. They did not run, they did not fight, they did not have the chance to do either. Whoever came into that house that night moved through it like a decision that had already been made. And when it was over, 3 young people who had gone to sleep expecting to wake up in the morning never did. Edward Kaler was 17 years old. Kai Geyer was 15. Stephen Watson was 15. 3 boys at the age where life is still mostly in front of you, where the biggest concerns are supposed to be school and friends and whatever comes next. None of them got a next. None of them got to find out who they were going to become. Their futures were not taken from them in a moment of chaos or accident or tragedy in the conventional sense. They were erased, deliberately, while they slept. Think about the families for a moment, not abstractly. Actually think about them. 3 separate households, 3 sets of parents who had tucked their children in, or said goodnight, or assumed, the way parents always assume, that their child was safe because their child was home. 3 Christmas mornings that never happened after January 1998. 3 chairs at 3 tables that became impossible to look at and impossible to remove. 3 futures: college, jobs, marriages, children of their own, the full sprawling, unpredictable mess of a human life. Gone, not delayed, not interrupted. Gone completely, on a single night, in a single house in Amarillo, Texas. That is the foundation of this case. That is what John Ballantyne was convicted of. And before we go anywhere else in this story, that needs to sit in the room for a moment, because what comes next is complicated. And the complications do not erase those three boys, and they're not meant to. John Ballantyne was a black man living in Amarillo in 1998. He was convicted of the triple murder and sentenced to death. The evidence against him was presented to a jury that his attorneys later argued was racially compromised. A panel that did not reflect the community in a meaningful way, drawn from a pool in a system that, in Amarillo, Texas, in 1998, had well-documented patterns of how it assembled juries when the defendant was black and the stakes were the highest they could be. Ballantyne's legal team spent years building the argument that racial bias had infected not just the jury selection, but the entire scaffolding of his trial, the way witnesses were treated, the way his attorneys were resourced, the way the machinery of the Amarillo justice system moved, quickly, decisively toward a death sentence, in a case involving a black defendant and three white victims. These were not vague accusations. These were documented arguments, filed in court, supported by legal analysis, and taken seriously enough by civil rights attorneys and capital punishment scholars that they were still being actively litigated when February 2023 arrived. Here is the moment in this story where you need to pay attention, because this is where the system revealed something about itself. In the days before John Ballantyne's scheduled execution, his attorneys went to the United States Supreme Court. They did not ask the court to declare him innocent. They did not ask the court to overturn his conviction outright. They asked for something much smaller and much harder to refuse. They asked the court to pause the execution long enough to allow a proper review of the racial bias claims, to actually look at the evidence, to actually examine whether the trial that sent this man to death row had been fair. The Supreme Court of the United States said no. Not, we have reviewed the claims, and they lack merit. Not, we have examined the record, and the trial was sound. Just no. A refusal to engage. A decision not to decide. The highest court in the country, the institution that exists specifically to ensure the Constitution is applied consistently and fairly to every American, regardless of race or circumstance, looked at a documented argument about racial bias in a capital case, a case where the consequence was irreversible and permanent, and declined to review it. Now, here's the question you have to sit with, and I'm not going to answer it for you because it does not have a clean answer, and anyone who tells you it does is not being honest with you. Did John Ballantyne kill those three boys? Maybe. The jury said yes. The evidence presented at trial pointed toward him. He was convicted, and conviction in a court of law is not nothing. It is the mechanism our entire system of justice depends on to function. But here is the other question, the one that does not go away just because we have an answer to the first one. Did John Ballantyne get a fair trial? Because those two questions are not the same question. A person can be guilty and still receive an unfair trial. Those things are not mutually exclusive. And in a system where the punishment is death, where there is no appeal from the grave, no exoneration that means anything once the body has gone cold, the fairness of the process is not a procedural footnote. It is the entire point. It is what separates a justice system from something else entirely. The Supreme Court declined to find out. That is not an opinion. That is what happened. They had the chance to look, and they chose not to. Days before a man was scheduled to die in a way that cannot be undone. Make of that what you will. John Ballantyne's attorneys also raised the question of intellectual disability, arguing that his cognitive limitations should have disqualified him from execution under the Supreme Court's own precedent in Atkins versus Virginia, which bars the execution of intellectually disabled individuals. That claim was also rejected. The legal system moved through every argument, dismissed every appeal, and on the evening of February 8, 2023, John Ballantyne, 54 years old, was walked into the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit. The witnesses gathered, the families of Edward Kaler, Kai Geyer, and Stephen Watson, people who had waited 25 years for this moment, who had carried January 1998 inside them through every season that followed, were there. And whatever they felt watching John Ballantyne strapped to that gurney is theirs. It belongs to them. It is not available for outside interpretation. The warden asked if he had a final statement. John Ballantyne spoke. He addressed the families of the victims and said he was sorry for their pain. He maintained, in those final moments, a composure that the observers in that room noted, a stillness that could mean many different things depending on what you believe about him. Then the lethal injection began. He took 2 breaths. Then he snored, one loud involuntary sound that several witnesses described as startling in the silence of that room. And then he was still, completely and permanently still. The warden checked for a response and found none. A medical official confirmed what the room already knew. At 6:36 p.m. on February 8, 2023, John Ballantyne was pronounced dead, 15 minutes after the drugs began to flow. He was 54 years old. 3 teenagers went to sleep in Amarillo in January 1998 and did not wake up. That is a fact. That is the beginning of this story, and it does not change regardless of anything else in it. And a black man in Texas was convicted of those murders by a jury whose composition his attorneys called into question for 25 years, raising arguments that the highest court in the country ultimately refused to examine before allowing the execution to proceed. That is also a fact. It also does not change. Both of those things are true at the same time. And the American legal system, which was built on the premise that fairness matters, that process matters, that the rights of the accused exist precisely because the power of the state to take a life must be checked and rechecked and checked again, allowed both of those things to be true simultaneously and moved forward anyway. Whether that is justice or whether it is something we do not yet have the right word for, is a question that will follow the Ballantyne case for as long as people are willing to ask it. If you are still here, if these first 3 cases have not sent you reaching for something easier to watch, I want you to stay. Because we are not yet at the cases in 2023 that raised the loudest questions about innocence. We are not yet at the executions where the arguments were not about bias or brain science or expired drugs, but about whether Texas was preparing to execute or had already executed the wrong person entirely. Those cases are coming. But first, on March 7, 2023, Texas executed a man named Gary Green, and the question his case forces us to ask is one that the death penalty debate almost never confronts directly. When a person has spent 13 years on death row, when the man who committed the crime has by every measure become someone different from the person who did it, does that matter? Should it? Texas has an answer. It is the same answer it always gives. That is next. Case 4, Gary Green. 2 women are dead. That is where this story starts, and that is where it has to start, because everything else that follows, every argument about reform, about redemption, about who Gary Green was by the time Texas finally executed him, has to be measured against that fixed, permanent, unchangeable fact. 2 women, 2 lives, 2 families that will carry the weight of what happened to them, long after every camera has moved on and every documentary has been filed away, and the name Gary Green has faded from everything except the memory of the people who loved what he took from them. We do not know enough about the victims in this case. That is itself a failure, not of this script, but of the way capital cases get covered, where the legal arguments and the condemned man's story gradually crowd out the people whose deaths made any of it necessary in the first place. 2 black women in Texas, killed, their families left behind to grieve without the luxury of a high-profile case, drawing national attention, without the civil rights attorneys and Supreme Court filings that follow cases where the legal questions are more legible to the outside world. They deserved more than a footnote. They deserved their full story told. And whatever you think about Gary Green, whatever you conclude by the end of this segment, that debt to them does not go away. Gary Green was convicted of both murders and sentenced to death. He entered the Polunsky unit as one man and spent the next 13 years becoming, according to the people who knew him on death row, someone meaningfully different. Not a different person in the legal sense. The courts do not recognize transformation as a defense against a death sentence, and they are consistent about that, but different in the way that humans can be different when they are forced, by circumstance and time, and the complete removal of every distraction life normally provides, to confront what they have done. People who corresponded with Gary Green during those 13 years described a man who had done that confrontation, who had sat inside the unbearable silence of a cell on death row and looked directly at what he had taken from two women and their families and had not looked away. Whether that matters, whether it should matter, is the question his supporters never stopped asking. Texas never wavered in its answer. The law does not ask who you have become. It asks what you did, and what Gary Green did was take 2 lives. The sentence for that in the state of Texas was death. The fact that 13 years had passed between the sentencing and the execution did not change the crime, did not restore the victims, did not reopen any door that had been permanently closed on the night he killed them. That is the argument for moving forward, and it is not a frivolous argument. But here's the argument on the other side, the one that Gary Green's case puts in sharp relief, in a way that is difficult to dismiss if you're willing to sit with it honestly. 13 years on death row in Texas means 13 years at the Polunsky unit, in conditions that human rights organizations have repeatedly described as among the most psychologically brutal in the American prison system. Death row inmates in Texas are held in single-person cells for approximately 22 to 23 hours per day. They eat alone. They exist in a space roughly the size of a large bathroom. They have almost no meaningful human contact. They live under a sentence of death, which means every morning they wake up knowing, with legal certainty, that the state intends to kill them, and that the only question is when. The psychological literature on solitary confinement, not opinion, not advocacy, peer-reviewed research, is unambiguous about what this does to a human mind. Anxiety, hallucinations, hypersensitivity to stimuli, a progressive deterioration of the cognitive and emotional architecture that makes a person who they are. The United Nations has called prolonged solitary confinement a form of torture. Not a harsh condition, not a difficult environment. Torture. America does not use that word about its own prisons. It is very uncomfortable with that word when it appears in this context. Because if prolonged solitary confinement is torture, and the evidence suggests strongly that it is, then the question of what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment in the American death penalty system becomes a great deal more complicated than the injection that ends it. The debate about whether the death penalty itself is cruel and unusual has been in American courts for decades. But the debate about the years before the execution, the isolation, the waiting, the psychological dismantling of a person who is being kept alive specifically so that they can be killed on a schedule, that debate is one that the system has been extraordinarily successful at avoiding. Because answering it honestly would require looking at thousands of cases, thousands of men and women in cells across multiple states, and it would require admitting that the punishment being debated is not just the needle, it is everything that comes before it. Gary Green spent 13 years in that system, 13 years of solitary hours and institutional noise, and the specific psychological weight of knowing your death has been decided and is simply waiting for a date. Whether the man who walked into the execution chamber on March 7, 2023 bore any meaningful resemblance, in mind, in soul, in whatever it is we mean when we talk about a person, to the man who committed those murders, is a question nobody in that chamber was authorized to ask. The law had already answered it, 13 years earlier. 2 women were killed. Their families have lived with that since the day it happened, not for 13 years, but for every year since, with no end to it, with the grief simply becoming part of the permanent architecture of their lives. Whatever anyone says about Gary Green's transformation on death row, whatever case his supporters made for the man he had become, those families did not get a transformation. They did not get a reformed version of the person they lost. They got the loss, and they kept it, and they will keep it until their own last day. That is the unbearable math of murder. The victim does not get to be reformed. The victim does not get a second act. The family does not get to watch their loved one grow and change and become someone new. They get the absence, permanent, total, non-negotiable, and they learn to build their lives around a hole that never fills. No argument about redemption changes that. No argument about solitary confinement changes that. Both things are true simultaneously, and the death penalty forces them into the same room and asks you to decide which one matters more. Most people, when pushed, will tell you the victims matter most, and they're not wrong. But the system that claims to speak for those victims, the system that promises justice in their name, is the same system that held Gary Green in a cell for 13 years, under conditions its own treaty obligations define as torture, before walking him to a gurney and injecting him with drugs whose expiration dates had been extended past legal pharmaceutical standards. That system is speaking in the victims' names. The question worth asking, the one nobody in official Texas was asking on March 7, 2023, is whether it was doing so honestly. Gary Green was pronounced dead on March 7, 2023. He was 52 years old, 13 years on death row, 2 lives taken before that. And the debate about who he was by the end that the state of Texas had no legal mechanism to engage with and no apparent interest in trying. 2 days after Gary Green's execution, Texas returned to the Huntsville unit. The next man on the schedule had been waiting even longer, 30 years. 3 full decades inside that system, inside that cell, inside that sentence, and the crime he was convicted of, 4 people killed, 2 of them at a single gathering, was the kind of case that juries in Texas move toward death quickly and completely, and without much visible hesitation. His name was Arthur Brown, Jr. And the question his 30 years on death row forces into the open is the same one Gary Green's 13 raised, but louder and harder to ignore, and sitting on top of a body count that makes it even more uncomfortable to ask. That is next. Case 5. Arthur Brown, Jr. There was a gathering. That is the detail that makes this one different from every other case in 2023. Not a stranger in a garage, not a chase on a highway, not 3 teenagers asleep in their beds. A gathering, the kind of ordinary human event that happens in every neighborhood, in every city, in every country on earth. People who knew each other, people who came together because that is what people do. Because life, at its most basic level, is about showing up in the same place as the people you care about. 4 of those people did not go home. 4 people killed at or connected to a single event. 2 Latino men, 1 Latina woman, 1 black woman. 4 separate lives, 4 separate families, 4 separate sets of people who got a phone call or a knock on the door, or a silence where a voice should have been, and whose lives divided instantly and permanently into before and after. This is the crime that put Arthur Brown, Jr. on death row, and he stayed there for 30 years. 30 years. Before we go any further into what those 30 years mean, and we're going to go there fully because it demands to be examined, we need to stay here for a moment with the 4 people who were killed, because this story, like every story in this documentary, has a gravitational center, and that center is not Arthur Brown, Jr. It is the people he took. 4 families, 4 sets of parents, siblings, children, friends, 4 futures that were not interrupted, but ended completely, without appeal, without a process, without a 30-year waiting period. The victims did not get appeals. They did not get decades to reflect and correspond and build relationships with supporters and file legal motions. They got the moment it happened, and then nothing. Some of the family members who were adults when those four people were killed were elderly by the time 2023 arrived. 30 years is the length of a career. It is the span between a young adult and middle age. It is long enough for the children of those victims to have grown up, had children of their own, and watched those children grow. 30 years of carrying the weight of a single night. 30 years of every birthday and holiday and quiet Tuesday afternoon being shadowed by what was taken. Some of those family members may not have lived to see this day. Think about that. The families of Arthur Brown Jr.'s victims waited 30 years for the execution that had been promised to them by the justice system, and some of them, statistically, almost certainly died before it happened. They went to their own graves still waiting. The justice that Texas told them was coming arrived too late for them to witness it. That is not a hypothetical. That is the arithmetic of a 30-year delay applied to human lifespans. And it is one of the costs of a capital punishment system that promises finality and then stretches it across decades of appeals and reviews and procedural motions until the people the system claimed to be serving are no longer there to receive what it delivers. And yet, Arthur Brown Jr. spent those same 30 years at the Polunsky unit in a cell under a sentence of death. We talked about what that means in the last segment. The solitary confinement, the psychological research, the United Nations designation. All of that applies here, multiplied by time. Gary Green spent 13 years in that system. Arthur Brown Jr. spent 30. 30 years of waking up every morning knowing you were going to be killed. Not might be, not could be, are going to be, the only open question being when 30 years of a brain and a body doing whatever they do when they're held in near total isolation under a permanent sentence of death. 30 years of institutional food and fluorescent light and the specific silence of a cell that never fully goes quiet because there are other men in other cells doing the same thing, and the building itself holds the sound of all of them. Which punishment is crueler? That is the question this case forces into the open. And it is a question that the American legal system does not have a formal mechanism for answering, because the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment has been interpreted, consistently and deliberately, in a way that evaluates the execution itself in isolation from the decades that preceded. The Supreme Court has ruled that lethal injection, administered correctly, does not constitute cruel and unusual punishment. What it has not ruled, what it has carefully and consistently declined to rule, is whether the combination of the execution and the 30 years of psychological deterioration that preceded, taken together as a single continuous experience, clears that bar. Japan's Supreme Court has ruled that prolonged death row detention can itself constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Several European courts have found that extraditing a person to a country where they might face execution after years on death row constitutes inhumane treatment under international human rights law. The legal framework exists internationally to ask this question. American courts do not ask it. Arthur Brown Jr. filed appeals for 30 years. That is the fact that the families of his victims lived alongside, that while they were growing old and grieving and waiting, he was alive and legally active and occupying space in a system that kept returning to his case, reviewing it, considering it, and arriving at the same answer every time. There is an argument that says this is exactly how the system should work, that in a case where the punishment is irreversible, the process of review cannot be rushed, and every year of appeals is a year in which an error might be caught before it becomes permanent. That argument is not wrong. Exonerations happen. DNA evidence overturns convictions. People who were going to be executed turn out to be innocent. And the years of appeals are the only thing that stood between them and a death they did not deserve. But for the families of the four people Arthur Brown Jr. killed, those 30 years did not feel like due process working as intended. They felt like something being withheld. Justice placed just out of reach. Year after year, appeal after appeal. while the man who had destroyed their families continued to breathe and eat and exist in a way that his victims were permanently denied. He breathed air they never got to breathe for 30 years. On the morning of March 9th, 2023, Arthur Brown Jr. was transferred to the Huntsville unit for the last time. He had entered the Texas prison system as a young man. He was 52 years old when he was walked into the execution chamber, an age that would have been entirely unremarkable in any other context, but that in this one represented the full span of a life lived almost entirely in a cell, under a sentence, waiting. The warden asked if he had a final statement. Whatever Arthur Brown Jr. said in those final moments, whatever accounting he offered or did not offer, whatever words he directed at the families of the 4 people who never got to grow old the way he did, those words landed in a room that had been waiting 30 years for something no statement could fully satisfy. The injection began. And here's the thing about a 30-year death sentence that none of the legal arguments, none of the appeals, none of the official language ever quite captures. By the time the execution actually happens, almost nobody is the same. The families are older, some of them gone. The lawyers have changed. The judges who sentenced him may themselves be dead. The witnesses in the original case have moved or faded or forgotten details. The world has turned 30 times since the crime was committed, and the only things that have not changed, the only things that are exactly as they were on the night it happened, are the fact that 4 people are dead and the fact that Arthur Brown Jr. killed them. Those 2 facts do not age. They do not soften. They do not become less true with the passage of time. Everything else does. Arthur Brown Jr. was pronounced dead on March 9th, 2023. He was 52 years old, 30 years on death row, 4 people in the ground before him. And somewhere in the gap between those numbers, between the crime and the execution, between the victims and the condemned, between justice promised and justice finally delivered, is a question about what we actually mean when we use that word. Justice. Whether what happened on March 9th, 2023 was it, or whether it was simply the end of a very long process that had its own costs and its own damage and its own trail of broken things, that is not a question Texas was asking. But it is a question the record will keep asking, long after the names fade. We are 5 executions into 2023. 5 men dead by the state's hand in the space of 60 days. And the pace does not slow. Less than 3 months later, in June, Texas executed a man whose case raises something none of the previous 4 have directly confronted. The question of what happens when the condemned man himself was once a child who was failed, systematically and completely, by every institution that was supposed to protect him. His name was Jedediah Murphy. And his story begins not with a crime, but with a childhood that the state of Texas created, and then, decades later, used as no defense at all. That is next. Case 6. Jedediah Murphy. Most people have never heard this name. That is the first thing worth saying about Jedediah Murphy. Not what he did, not how he died, but the silence around him. The way his case exists in the public record, the way a footnote exists in a book nobody reads, processed by the system, filed, executed, and absorbed into the long, undifferentiated list of men Texas has put to death, without the Supreme Court filings or the civil rights attorneys or the national headlines that follow the cases that get to be stories. Jedediah Murphy did not get to be a story. Neither did his victim. That is the thing about death row in America that the debate around capital punishment almost never confronts directly. We talk about the cases that generate attention, the ones with documented racial bias or expired drugs or teenagers with underdeveloped frontal lobes or Supreme Court petitions filed days before the execution. Those cases pull focus. They become the face of the argument. They're the ones cited in law review articles and referenced in congressional testimony and turned into documentaries. But for every case like that, there are cases like this one. Cases where a man was convicted, sentenced, exhausted his appeals, and was executed. And the entire arc of that process happened in something close to complete public silence, where the crime was real and the sentence was legal, and the machinery moved exactly as it was designed to move, and nobody outside the courtroom and the prison was watching. Jedediah Murphy was convicted of capital murder in Texas. The violence prosecutors described at trial was not impulsive or chaotic. It was deliberate, calculated. The kind of crime that the prosecution argued revealed something about the person who committed it. Not a moment of lost control, not a decision made in a fractured second under pressure, but a sustained, intentional act carried out with a coldness that the jury found impossible to look past. Prosecutors argued that what the evidence showed was a complete absence of remorse or empathy. Not a man who had done something terrible and could not face it, but a man who had done something terrible and, in the critical window after doing it, appeared to feel the weight of it not at all. That argument landed. The jury voted for death. Somewhere, there is a family that lives with what Jedediah Murphy did. Not in the abstract, in the specific, daily grinding reality of it. They wake up with it. They carry it to work and to dinner and to every ordinary moment that keeps happening, despite everything, the way ordinary moments insist on doing. They carry it to the holidays that are supposed to be joyful and cannot be, not fully, not anymore. They carry it into every quiet room where the absence of the person they lost becomes loudest, because grief does not announce itself in the moments of obvious sorrow. It announces itself in the Tuesday afternoons and the Sunday mornings and the random Wednesday when something happens that you want to tell them, and then you remember. That family does not get closure in a headline. They do not get closure in a courtroom. They do not get it in a documentary segment, or in a lethal injection, or in the official recording of a time of death by a state medical official in a room in Huntsville, Texas. They get the loss, permanent and total, and they carry it every single day. Whatever Jedediah Murphy did or did not feel in the years between his conviction and his execution, that carrying never stopped. That family never put the weight down. No appeal process relieved them of it. No stay of execution gave them a break from it. While lawyers filed motions and courts reviewed records and the legal machinery ran its course, the people who loved the person he killed simply kept living inside the aftermath of what he did. That is the part of these cases that disappears entirely when the focus shifts to the condemned. And the focus almost always shifts to the condemned, because the condemned is still present, still speaking, still filing documents and making arguments, while the victim has been silent since the night they died. The victim does not get an attorney. The victim does not get appeals. The victim made one final appearance in this story, in the crime itself, and has been absent from every scene since. Jedediah. The name is Old Testament. It means beloved of God, a name given to Solomon in the second book of Samuel, a name carrying the weight of covenant and divine favor, and the specific kind of promise that religious parents place on a child when they reach for something bigger than themselves to name him after. Whether the man who carried that name into a Texas courtroom was given the kind of life that name implied is a question the record does not answer clearly. What the record shows is a conviction, a sentence, and an execution. The space between those three facts, the childhood, the history, the circumstances that produce a person who commits the kind of violence that a jury finds unforgivable. That space is one the legal system moves through quickly and does not linger in. The law is not required to explain how someone became what they became. It is only required to respond to what they did. And here is the quiet injustice that this case makes visible, not the injustice of the verdict, not an argument that Jedediah Murphy did not deserve his sentence, but a different kind of injustice, smaller and less dramatic, and in some ways more pervasive than the ones that generate legal briefs and national coverage. The injustice of invisibility. The cases that do not generate headlines, the men on death row whose names never trend, whose executions are noted in a paragraph in a local newspaper and then buried, whose victims are remembered only by the people who knew them. Those cases are the majority of what the death penalty actually looks like in practice. Not the Supreme Court battles, not the documented bias and the civil rights attorneys. The quiet, unobserved, unremarked machinery of a system processing human beings at regular intervals with the efficiency of something that has been doing this long enough that it no longer needs an audience to function. Jedediah Murphy was executed in 2023. His victim deserved to have their full story told. He deserved to have his full story told. Neither of them got that. And the system that decided his fate, the same system that processed Robert Fratta and Wesley Ruiz and John Ballantine and Gary Green and Arthur Brown Jr., moved forward without noticing the silence, because the silence is not a malfunction. It is a feature. When a case generates no coverage, the questions that should be asked simply do not get asked. Was the process fair? Was the evidence sound? Were there factors in this man's history, in his childhood, in the circumstances that shaped the person who walked into that crime, that the trial was not resourced or inclined to fully explore? Was the victim's family given what they needed? Did anyone at any point in this process ask whether the outcome served the people it was supposed to serve? We do not know, because nobody was watching. And in a system with the power to permanently end a human life, the absence of witnesses is not a neutral condition. Jedediah Murphy was pronounced dead in 2023. The exact details of his final hours, his last meal, his last words, the specific number of minutes between the injection and the flatline exist in the official record of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. In the same bureaucratic language used for every other execution, the language of a system that has done this enough times that it has developed forms for it. He was 52 years old at the time of his death, according to available records. Whether anyone outside the execution chamber and his immediate family marked the moment, whether the world noticed at all, is answered by the silence this case arrived in and the silence it departed in. There are 2 executions left in 2023. Both happened in November. Both involved men who had been on death row long enough to have watched the world change around them from inside a cell. And the second of those 2 cases, the final execution of the year, involves a victim who was a child, a little girl, and a man who, standing at the edge of the gurney, still maintained that Texas was about to kill the wrong person. Whether you believe him, whether the evidence supports him, is something we're going to walk through completely. But first, on November 9th, 2023, Texas executed Brent Brewer, a man who had been on death row for 32 years, a man who had entered that system young enough that the world he was executed in bore almost no resemblance to the world in which he had committed his crime. 32 years. The number alone is a kind of argument. Whether it is an argument for anything or against anything depends entirely on what you believe justice is supposed to do. That is next. Case 7. Brent Brewer. He was a young man when they took him in. That is the fact that sits underneath everything else in this story and refuses to move. Brent Brewer was young when he committed the crime that sent him to death row. Young enough that the version of him who entered the Polunsky unit and the version of him who was walked into the Huntsville execution chamber on November 9th, 2023, were separated not just by 32 years of calendar time, but by the full biological and psychological transformation of a human being from youth into middle age. He entered as one person. He left as a body. The man he killed never got that. Whatever age his victim was on the night Brent Brewer ended his life, whatever years he had already lived, whatever years he had in front of him, those years stopped, completely and permanently. The victim did not get to age, did not get to change, did not get to spend 32 years becoming someone different from the person he was on. The night he died, he got the night, and then nothing. A fixed point in time, preserved in a case file, referenced in appeals, reduced by the machinery of the legal system to a name and a set of facts that were reviewed and re-reviewed for over 3 decades without him ever being able to weigh in on any of it. That is the asymmetry at the heart of every death penalty case that stretches across decades. The condemned keeps accumulating time. The victim does not. Brent Brewer's victim had a family, people who received the news of his death and had to find a way to keep living after it. People who then discovered that keeping living meant being periodically, repeatedly, systematically dragged back to the worst moment of their lives every time the legal system needed to revisit the case. Because that is what a 32-year appeals process actually looks like from the outside of the courtroom. It is not an abstraction. It is a phone call from an attorney telling you there is a new filing. It is a hearing date that requires you to show up and sit in a room and listen to arguments about the man who killed someone you loved, while that man sits in the same room, breathing and present and legally alive. It is a news cycle that reactivates every few years when an appeal reaches a higher court and journalists start calling again. It is the grief, which you have spent years learning to live alongside, suddenly loud again. Not because something new has happened, but because the process requires you to revisit it. 32 years of that. That is not justice. That is a second sentence, written in the fine print of a capital punishment system that promises closure and delivers a decades-long procedural ordeal instead. The victim's family did not choose that sentence. They did not file for it. They did not ask for 32 years of hearings and reviews and stays and new filings. They asked for justice, and what the system handed them was a process, vast, slow, grinding, and utterly indifferent to the cost it imposed on the people it was supposedly serving. The people who design that process are not the people who live inside it. That gap between the architects of the system and the families who have to inhabit it is one of the least examined failures of capital punishment in America. And yet, here is the other side of 32 years, stated plainly and without apology, because it deserves to be stated. The American death penalty system has executed innocent people. That is not a fringe claim. That is the documented, evidenced, legally established conclusion of decades of post-conviction review. Since 1973, more than 190 people on death row in the United States have been exonerated, found innocent after conviction, after sentencing, after years of appeals, after the system had already decided they should die. 190 people. Some of them came within days of execution before evidence emerged that changed everything. Some of them were exonerated because of DNA technology that did not exist when they were convicted. Some of them were exonerated because a witness recanted, or a prosecutor's misconduct was finally exposed, or a piece of evidence that had been withheld came to light. And some of them were not exonerated in time. Some of them were executed, and the evidence that would have saved them emerged afterward, too late for anything except the historical record, which is cold comfort for a person who is already dead and cannot receive it. This is not a hypothetical. This is what the system has done on record, in reality, with names attached. Cameron Todd Willingham, Larry Griffin, Reuben Cantu. Names that belong to the category of probable wrongful executions. Cases where the weight of post-execution evidence shifted dramatically enough that serious legal scholars have concluded the state almost certainly killed an innocent person. The system did not pause for those cases either. So here is the impossible arithmetic that Brent Brewer's 32 years puts on the table. If he was guilty, and the jury that heard the evidence concluded that he was, then 32 years of delays imposed a devastating secondary punishment on the victim's family, stringing out their grief across 3 decades in the name of a process that ultimately arrived at the same conclusion it started with. But if there had been even a 1% chance that he was not guilty, if somewhere in those 32 years of appeals there had been a piece of evidence waiting to be found, a witness whose testimony had been misrepresented, a forensic conclusion that later science would have dismantled, then those 32 years were not dysfunction. They were the system doing the only thing it can do to partially compensate for the fact that what it is authorized to do cannot be undone. The problem And this is the problem that capital punishment forces every honest observer to confront, is that you cannot tell which category a case belongs to until after the execution. And after the execution, the distinction no longer matters to the person who was killed by the state. It only matters to history. And history does not offer compensation. Brent Brewer spent 32 years in that cell. Longer than some marriages, longer than most careers, longer than the entire adult life of some of the people watching this video right now. He entered the Texas prison system young and emerged from it in a body bag at 53, having spent the majority of his adult existence inside a sentence. Whether that constitutes justice, whether the combination of 32 years of psychological imprisonment followed by lethal injection is a proportionate response to the crime he committed, or whether it is something more complicated and less clean than the word justice usually implies, is a question Texas had already answered before anyone thought to ask it. On November 9th, 2023, Brent Brewer was pronounced dead. He was 53 years old. 32 years after the crime. 20 years after the world changed in ways he experienced only through whatever filtered into a cell at the Polunsky unit. A lifetime inside a sentence ended on a schedule. And 1 week later, Texas came back. The eighth and final execution of 2023. The last name on this list, and the one that, out of all 8, carries the weight that is hardest to set down when this video ends, because the victim was a child. A little girl who had a name and a mother and a future. And the man executed for her murder looked at the witnesses in that chamber and said, in his final breaths, that Texas was killing the wrong person. His name was David Renteria. And whether you believe him, whether the evidence gives you any reason to, is something you're going to have to decide for yourself. Because the state of Texas already decided 15 years ago, and on November 16, 2023, it made that decision permanent. That is next, and it is the one that stays with you. Case 8. David Renteria. She was a little girl. Hold that. Before the legal arguments and the innocence claims and the 15 years of appeals and the final statement and the time of death recorded in a government document in bureaucratic language, hold that single fact and do not let the machinery of this story move you past it too quickly. She was a little girl. She had a name. She had a birthday that someone celebrated. She had a mother who dressed her in the morning and sent her out into a world that was supposed to be navigable, that was supposed to have enough adults in it paying enough attention to keep a child safe. She had a future that existed for a while as a real thing, not a metaphor, not a rhetorical device, but an actual unwritten set of years that belonged to her and that she had every right to expect. She did not get them. Somewhere, her mother is still alive. And every morning that mother wakes up is a morning she spends the first conscious seconds of replaying something. The last time she saw her daughter, the last thing she said to her, the last ordinary moment before the world divided into before and after. She has searched that memory for years, the way bereaved parents always do, looking for the thing she missed, the sign she should have seen, the decision that could have been different and wasn't. There was nothing. There was no sign she missed and no decision she made wrong. She did not fail her daughter. She sent her child out into a world that failed them both. The only person responsible for what happened to that little girl is the person who chose to do it. Whatever you conclude about David Renteria, whatever the evidence suggests, whatever his final words implied, that does not change. The little girl is still gone. Her mother still wakes up every morning carrying it. That is fixed. That is permanent. That does not move regardless of anything else in this segment. David Renteria was convicted of the murder of a young Latina girl in El Paso, Texas. He was sentenced to death and sent to the Polunsky unit, where he spent 15 years filing appeals, maintaining his innocence, and insisting, consistently, repeatedly, to anyone who would listen, that Texas had the wrong man. 15 years is a long time to maintain a position. long enough that the people closest to these cases, the attorneys, the advocates, the people who spend their careers examining the gap between what juries decide and what the evidence actually supports, began to pay attention. Not because innocence claims are unusual on death row. They are not. Almost every condemned man says he did not do it. That is the background noise of capital punishment. What made Renteria's claims different, what kept them alive through 15 years of appeals, were the specific questions his attorneys raised about the evidence. Questions that did not have clean answers. Questions that the courts reviewed and rejected, but that legal observers continued to find troubling enough that they did not quietly disappear the way most rejected arguments do. The details of those questions, the specific evidentiary challenges, the forensic arguments, the claims about how the case was built and what was left out of it, are documented in the appellate record. They are available to anyone willing to read them. And what they describe, at minimum, is a case that was not as airtight as capital cases are supposed to be before the state of Texas takes the irreversible step of ending a human life. Whether that means Renteria was innocent is not something this documentary can establish. It is not something anyone can establish now, because the one mechanism that exists for establishing it with finality, a thorough and unobstructed review of the evidence, was not granted before the execution proceeded. What can be established is this: he said he did not do it. His attorneys raised substantive questions about the evidence. The courts declined to pursue those questions to a definitive conclusion. And on November 16, 2023, Texas moved forward anyway. In the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit, with witnesses gathered on the other side of the glass, David Renteria was strapped to the gurney. Among those witnesses were people who had waited 15 years for this moment. People who had loved that little girl, who had carried the weight of her absence through every season since she was taken, who needed the machinery of the state to finally, permanently close this. The warden asked if he had a final statement. David Renteria spoke, and in his final breaths, in the last words he would ever say, with the needle already in his arm and nothing left to gain or lose from any position he took, he maintained his innocence. He said Texas was executing the wrong man. He said he did not kill that little girl. And then the drugs began to flow. There are two possibilities, and they cannot both be true, and there is no longer any way to determine with certainty which one is correct. The first possibility is that David Renteria was guilty, that the jury got it right, that the 15 years of appeals were the system working as intended, reviewing, confirming, and ultimately upholding a verdict that was sound, that his final claim of innocence was the last act of a man who had spent 15 years refusing to accept what he had done, and that the family of that little girl received on November 16, 2023, the justice that had been promised to them. The second possibility is that he was telling the truth. If he was telling the truth, if the questions his attorneys raised about the evidence were pointing at something real, something that a more thorough review might have exposed, then what happened on November 16, 2023 in the Huntsville unit is not justice. It is the thing that the death penalty's opponents have been warning about for decades. The thing that the 190-plus exonerations since 1973 exist as evidence of, the thing that keeps appellate attorneys working through the night on cases where the execution date is 2 weeks away and the window is closing and the courts keep saying no. The execution of an innocent person. Texas does not believe that happened. The courts that reviewed the case do not believe it happened. The jury that heard the evidence did not believe Renteria was innocent. But belief is not the same as certainty. And in a system with the power to do something that cannot be undone, the distance between belief and certainty is not a technicality. It is everything. David Renteria was pronounced dead on November 16, 2023. He was 54 years old, 15 years on death row. A little girl still gone, a mother still carrying it, and a question that the state of Texas answered with a needle and a flat line, and a time of death recorded in a government document. A question that history will keep asking long after the document has yellowed and the case has faded from everything except the memory of the people who lived inside it. Whether Texas got it right is something no one can say. with absolute certainty. Whether it matters that no one can say that with absolute certainty, that is the question this case leaves you with. And it is a question you do not get to put down just because the video is ending. 8 men. 8 gurneys in the same building in Huntsville, Texas, in the same calendar year. 8 syringes. 8 flatlines recorded by medical officials and filed in the official record of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice as if they were transactions, which, in a sense, is exactly what they were. The state collecting a debt it had decided in each case was owed. Some of those men wept, some prayed, some apologized to the families watching through the glass and said they hoped their deaths would bring closure. A word that sounds like a door but functions, for most families, like a window that will not fully close. Some said nothing meaningful at all, and one of them, a former police officer who had spent 27 years insisting he was innocent, looked at the room and said 2 words that nobody there knew what to do with. That depends. Here is the question that 2 words and 8 executions and 1 year in Texas leave you with. When the state kills a person, does it make anyone safer? Does it heal the families it claims to serve? Does it undo even 1 second of what the victims endured? Does it restore a single thing that was taken? Texas will tell you yes. The prosecutors who built these cases will tell you yes. The legislators who fund the system and the judges who uphold the sentences will tell you yes. And maybe they're right. But 2023 also showed us something that the official language of justice does not like to admit, that the death penalty is never clean. It is never the simple, final, morally unambiguous act that its proponents describe. It arrives after decades of delays that re-traumatize the families it promises to serve. It uses drugs whose expiration dates have been administratively extended past pharmaceutical standards. It is applied in a system where documented racial bias is raised in appeal after appeal, and the highest court in the country declines to look. It executes men who, in their final breaths, say they did not do it, and then moves on without ever fully resolving whether they were right. The death penalty is not just about the man on the gurney. It is about the victim who deserved better than to become a footnote in a legal argument. It is about the family that was promised closure and received a 30-year procedural ordeal. It is about the 23-year-old with an underdeveloped brain who made a decision that the state waited 16 years to respond to. It is about the black defendant whose racial bias claims the Supreme Court declined to examine 7 days before his execution. It is about the little girl. It is about her mother. It is about what we decide collectively that justice means, and whether the system we have built in that word's name is actually delivering it, or whether it is delivering something else entirely and calling it by the right name, because the alternative is too uncomfortable to face. It is about all of us. Because we built this system, we fund it, we elect the prosecutors and the judges and the governors who sign the death warrants. Every execution carried out in our name is carried out with our authorization, whether we were paying attention or not. 8 men, 1 year, 1 state. Were you paying attention? Drop a comment right now and tell us which of these 8 cases sits with you the most. The one you cannot stop thinking about. The one that landed differently from the others. We read every comment. We want to know. And if this documentary made you feel something, if any of these 8 stories stayed with you the way the best and worst true crime does, then subscribe before you close this tab, because we are not done with 2023. Every execution carried out across America in that year. Every state, every story, every final meal, every last word spoken by a person strapped to a gurney who knew they were about to die. We are covering all of it. There are stories in that list that will shake you in ways this one did not. There are names you have never heard that deserve to be heard. And there are questions about innocence, about bias, about what this country does in the name of justice and who it does it to, that we are not finished asking. Subscribe. Stay. The victims deserve witnesses,